For 8 long years, a devoted wife tirelessly cares for her sick husband, but on an unexpected day, she comes home early and uncovers a shocking secret that will change everything she thought she knew. Stay tuned to find out. But before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this tale of unexpected twists and life-changing moments, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Clara, with her quiet and persevering nature, became a living example of what it means to sacrifice for love. Every morning before the sun rose, she was already up, preparing for the day of care ahead. Her hands, once agile and light, now carried the weight of fatigue, but Clara pressed on, firm in her belief that her duty was greater than her own needs. She had given up her career, something many of us would never do without hesitation, but Clara felt that her purpose was to care for Carlos. It makes you think about what you would be willing to sacrifice for love, doesn't it? What Clara felt, deep down, was a mix of duty and devotion. Carlos, who had once been her great companion in life's adventures, now depended on her for even the simplest tasks. Their love was strong, but time and illness had transformed it into something deeper, almost unbreakable. Have you ever wondered how far you would go for someone you love? Perhaps until now you've never been put to the test, but Clara faced this test daily without complaint, and somehow this made her stronger. It was as if each day her courage grew, even as her physical strength waned. In the beginning, friends and family admired Clara's dedication, always ready to praise her courage. But over time, those visits became increasingly rare. It's interesting how society values heroism in its early stages, but then the constancy of sacrifice seems less impressive. Clara, however, didn't mind. She clung to those quiet moments with Carlos, those small moments of connection that, to her, were more valuable than any external recognition. And you, have you ever experienced something similar? A moment when your sacrifice was seen only by yourself? Clara's routine was exhausting, without a doubt. Every gesture, every task carried the weight of years of dedication. But at the same time, there was a certain comfort in knowing that she was there, fulfilling what she believed to be her mission. Routine, for many, can seem tedious, but for Clara, it was a foundation that kept her life in order, even when everything around her was in constant flux. She never stopped to think about what could have been if she had made different choices. Perhaps that's one of the most valuable lessons, accepting the path we've chosen, even if it's not the easiest one. How do you deal with the routines in your life? Have you ever thought that they might be the foundation of something greater? Carlos, for his part, always showed gratitude, but there was something in his eyes that Clara couldn't decipher. Perhaps it was guilt for seeing her sacrifice so much for him, or perhaps it was something else, something he never expressed in words. What goes through the mind of someone who finds themselves so dependent on another person? It's hard to imagine, but Clara never let this doubt take over her thoughts. For her, what mattered was being there, present, doing the best she could. Have you ever wondered if you could handle the same situation, putting someone else's needs above your own day after day without expecting anything in return? Time passed, and with it, the weight of the situation intensified. Carlos's illness progressed, and with it, the demands on Clara increased. Each new symptom, each new limitation, was another challenge to overcome. And despite everything, Clara never lost hope. She believed that somehow their love was strong enough to withstand anything. But the question that arises is, how far can love go before it turns into something different, something that mixes devotion and duty? Clara was willing to find out without hesitation. Nights were particularly difficult for Clara. While Carlos slept, she stayed awake, thinking about everything that had happened and what was yet to come. The darkness seemed to amplify her worries, but it was also in these moments that she felt most connected to herself. The solitude of the night brought forth deep reflections about her life, the choices she had made, and what the future held for them. It's during these solitary moments that we often find our most honest answers. Have you ever had nights like these where everything seems clearer despite the darkness? Clara never allowed herself to weaken in front of Carlos. To him, she was always the rock, unshakable and constant. But in her moments alone, she allowed the tears to flow, not out of regret, but out of exhaustion. It's human to feel the weight of sacrifice, and it's even more human to recognize that we need a moment to release that accumulated tension. This was Clara's secret. She knew that to stay strong, she needed those moments of vulnerability, and perhaps that's an important lesson for all of us. After all, there's no shame in admitting that we're human, with limits, with emotions, with the need for time for ourselves. But Clara knew she couldn't allow herself to stop for too long. Carlos's life depended on her, and that responsibility was what drove her every day. It was like a self-imposed mission, something she took on without question, but carried with all the weight that came with it. It makes you think about the responsibilities we take on, often without realizing how much they can transform us. Clara became a different woman because of Carlos, and perhaps deep down she knew that was the purpose of it all. Life has a peculiar way of shaping us through the challenges we face. Despite everything, Clara still found moments of joy, small but significant, like when Carlos managed to smile or when he remembered a happy memory from the past. These moments were like small rewards that made all the effort worthwhile. Clara learned to value these little things, something we could all learn to do more of. In the end, it's these small joys that give us the strength to keep going, isn't it? And can you identify these small rewards in your daily life? Every day was a battle for Clara, but it was also a victory. Waking up and knowing that she was doing the best she could, even if the world wasn't watching, was a form of courage that few understand. It's easy to be brave when there are applause, but it's in the silent battles that true courage is forged. Clara lived this daily, and it was her way of showing the world, even if no one was paying attention, that she was stronger than anyone could imagine. And you? Have you ever wondered where your true courage lies? But behind this strength, there was a question Clara avoided at all costs. How long could she keep up this dedication? A tired body, an overburdened mind, and a heart full of doubts. The love was great, but would it be enough to sustain her until the end? It's a difficult question, but Clara knew she had no choice but to continue. Like many of us, she put one foot in front of the other, day after day, trusting that the path would reveal itself one way or another. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson of all, trusting that, in the end, it will all make sense. Even with all the sacrifice, Clara never imagined that her life could be different. For her, taking care of Carlos was as natural as breathing. There was no regret, no resentment, just a serene acceptance of what life had placed in her path. But as we all know, life has a way of surprising us, especially when we least expect it. What Clara didn't know was that a twist was about to happen, something that would change everything she thought about her sacrifice. And that's when things really start to get interesting. As the days turned into months, Clara began to notice subtle changes in Carlos's behavior. He, who once relied on her for everything, started to become distant, almost as if he were slipping away into a world of his own. It was nothing drastic at first, just small things. A lack of eye contact, a delay in his responses. But Clara couldn't shake the growing unease that something wasn't right. She told herself it was just the disease progressing, but deep down, there was a nagging feeling that something more was at play. Have you ever had that gut feeling that something was off, but you couldn't quite put your finger on it? One afternoon, Clara caught Carlos looking at her with an expression she couldn't decipher. It wasn't the look of gratitude or love she was used to seeing, it was something else, something that made her heart skip a beat. She brushed it off, convincing herself it was just her imagination. After all, she had been under a lot of stress lately, and it was only natural for her mind to play tricks on her. But as the days went by, that look became more frequent, and Clara found herself avoiding Carlos's gaze, afraid of what she might see. It's strange how our minds can sense things before we consciously recognize them, isn't it? Despite the growing tension, Clara continued with her daily routine, trying to push those unsettling thoughts to the back of her mind. She had always been good at compartmentalizing, at focusing on what needed to be done rather than what might be. But there were moments when she couldn't ignore the feeling that Carlos was hiding something from her. She would catch him glancing away quickly when she entered the room, or hesitating before answering a simple question. It was as if he was living in two worlds, the one they shared, and another that was slowly pulling him away from her. Have you ever felt like someone you loved was drifting away, even if you couldn't explain why? One evening, as Clara was preparing dinner, she heard Carlos on the phone. His voice was low, almost a whisper, and she couldn't make out what he was saying. It was unusual for Carlos to speak so quietly. He usually had no trouble communicating, even in his weakened state. Curiosity got the better of her, and she moved closer to the door, trying to catch snippets of the conversation. But as soon as Carlos heard her approaching, he abruptly ended the call. Clara asked who he was talking to, but Carlos simply shrugged it off, saying it was no one important. That uneasy feeling in Clara's chest grew stronger, and she couldn't help but wonder who was on the other end of that call. Have you ever overheard something that made you question everything you thought you knew? Clara started to pay more attention to the little things, like the way Carlos would leave the room when his phone rang, or how he would quickly change the subject if she asked too many questions. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a distance that hadn't existed before. She began to wonder if she had done something wrong, or if Carlos was upset with her for some reason. But whenever she tried to bring it up, he would dismiss her concerns, telling her she was overthinking things. Still, that feeling of something being off wouldn't go away, and Clara found herself lying awake at night, turning over every interaction in her mind, searching for clues. As the weeks passed, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. She tried to rationalize it, telling herself that she was just being paranoid, but her instincts told her otherwise. There was a heaviness in the air, a tension that seemed to grow with each passing day. Clara started to notice other changes in Carlos too. He was more irritable, more withdrawn, and he seemed to be keeping secrets. It was as if a wall had gone up between them, and no matter how hard Clara tried, she couldn't break through it. It's amazing how we can sense when something is wrong, even before we have all the facts, isn't it? One day, Clara decided to test her suspicions. She told Carlos that she would be out all day running errands, but instead, she came home early, hoping to catch him in the act of whatever it was he was hiding. As she quietly entered the house, her heart pounded in her chest, half expecting to find him doing something completely out of character. But when she walked into the living room, she found Carlos sitting quietly, seemingly lost in thought. He looked up, surprised to see her, and for a moment, Clara felt foolish for doubting him. But as she moved closer, she noticed something in his expression, something that made her blood run cold. It was a fleeting look, but it was enough to confirm her worst fears. Clara didn't confront Carlos right away. Instead, she spent the next few days observing him more closely, trying to piece together the puzzle of his behavior. She noticed how he would stiffen when she mentioned certain topics, or how he would avoid looking her in the eye when he answered her questions. It was clear that something was weighing on him, something he wasn't telling her. Clara's mind raced with possibilities. Was he hiding a relapse in his condition? Was he keeping something else from her, something more personal? The uncertainty was eating away at her, but she knew she needed more evidence before she could confront him. The more Clara thought about it, the more convinced she became that something was terribly wrong. She started to question everything, every conversation, every interaction, every small detail that she might have overlooked before. It was as if a shadow had fallen over their relationship, and Clara was determined to find out what it was. But with each passing day, the distance between them seemed to grow, and Clara couldn't help but feel a sense of impending doom. It's strange how our instincts can pick up on things before our minds fully understand them, isn't it? Have you ever felt that way? Like you were on the brink of discovering something that would change everything? Clara's resolve to uncover the truth grew stronger with each passing day. She knew that whatever Carlos was hiding, it was something that could shatter the foundation of their relationship. But at the same time, she couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. What if the truth was something she couldn't handle? What if it was something that would destroy everything they had built together? These thoughts plagued her, but Clara knew that she couldn't live with the uncertainty any longer. She had to find out what was going on, no matter the cost. One afternoon, as Clara was cleaning up around the house, she came across a letter tucked away in one of Carlos's drawers. Her heart raced as she unfolded the paper, hoping to find some answers. But as she read the words on the page, a wave of confusion washed over her. The letter was from someone she didn't recognize, and the contents were vague, but there was an undeniable sense of secrecy about it. It was clear that Carlos had been hiding this from her, but the reasons why were still unclear. This discovery only fueled Clara's determination to get to the bottom of things, even if it meant confronting Carlos with evidence in hand. As Clara stood there holding the letter, she realized that the time had come to face the truth, whatever it might be. She couldn't continue living in the dark, plagued by doubts and suspicions. Clara knew that the next step would be the hardest, confronting Carlos and demanding the answers she so desperately needed. But as she prepared herself for that difficult conversation, a part of her still clung to the hope that there was an explanation, something that would make sense of it all. Yet deep down, Clara knew that once she crossed that line, there would be no going back. The tension in the air was palpable as Clara approached Carlos later that evening. She could feel the weight of the conversation they were about to have, and it filled her with a mixture of fear and determination. As she sat down beside him, Clara took a deep breath, ready to ask the questions that had been haunting her for weeks. But before she could say a word, Carlos looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen before, one of guilt, perhaps, or maybe something else entirely. In that moment, Clara knew that whatever he was about to say would change everything. As Clara stepped into the house, her heart pounded with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. She had returned earlier than usual, hoping to quell the nagging suspicion that had been growing inside her for weeks. The silence in the house was almost deafening, amplifying the tension in the air. Clara moved quietly, her senses heightened as if she were about to uncover something that would forever change the course of her life. And then, as she turned the corner into the living room, she froze. What she saw defied all logic and left her questioning everything she thought she knew about Carlos. Carlos, the man who had depended on her for nearly every aspect of his life, was standing in the middle of the room, his posture strong and confident. He was talking animatedly on the phone, his voice filled with energy and enthusiasm, so unlike the frail, weakened man she had been caring for. Clara's mind raced, struggling to process what she was witnessing. Could this be real? Had Carlos been deceiving her all along? The shock was overwhelming, and for a moment she felt as though the ground beneath her was crumbling away. Clara's initial reaction was disbelief. She stood there, hidden from view, watching Carlos with a mix of confusion and horror. It was as if she had stepped into an alternate reality, one where the rules she had lived by for years no longer applied. How could he have faked such an illness, and more importantly, why? The questions swirled in her mind, but the answers seemed just out of reach. Clara felt a surge of anger rise within her. How could he do this to her after everything she had sacrificed? As Carlos ended the call and began moving around the room with ease, Clara's shock began to give way to a burning sense of betrayal. She had given up so much for him, her career, her social life, her dreams. And now it seemed, all of that had been based on a lie. The weight of her sacrifice now felt unbearable, as if it had all been for nothing. Clara's thoughts were a tangled mess of emotions, anger, sadness, confusion, but beneath it all there was a growing need for answers. She knew she couldn't just stand there and watch. She had to confront him, demand the truth. But even as she prepared to step forward and reveal herself, a part of Clara hesitated. What if there was a reasonable explanation? What if Carlos had a good reason for hiding his recovery? The thought was fleeting, but it was enough to give her pause. Clara's mind raced with possibilities. Perhaps he had kept it from her to protect her, or maybe he was afraid of how she would react. But deep down, Clara knew that no explanation could fully justify the deceit she was witnessing. The trust between them had been shattered, and there was no easy way to rebuild it. Clara felt a lump form in her throat as she finally stepped into the room, her voice trembling as she called out Carlos's name. He turned to face her, and for a brief moment, she saw a flash of panic in his eyes. It was clear that he hadn't expected her to come home so early, and the realization of his exposure was written all over his face. Clara's heart ached as she watched him struggle to find the right words, his usual composure replaced by uncertainty and fear. The man she thought she knew so well now seemed like a stranger. The room was filled with a heavy silence as the reality of the situation settled in. Carlos stammered out an explanation, his words disjointed and unconvincing. He spoke of fear, of uncertainty, of not wanting to burden her with the truth. But as he continued to talk, Clara could feel the weight of his lies pressing down on her, suffocating her. The betrayal cut deep, and each word he spoke only made it worse. Clara's mind was reeling, trying to make sense of everything she had just witnessed, but nothing could ease the pain of knowing that the man she had devoted her life to had been deceiving her all along. As Carlos tried to explain himself, Clara felt a cold numbness wash over her. The emotions that had been swirling inside her, anger, sadness, disbelief, now felt distant, as if she were watching the scene unfold from outside her own body. She listened to Carlos's excuses, his justifications, but none of it mattered anymore. The trust that had once been the foundation of their relationship was gone, replaced by a chasm that seemed impossible to bridge. Clara knew that their lives would never be the same again, and the realization was as terrifying as it was heartbreaking. Carlos reached out to her, desperation in his eyes, but Clara recoiled, unable to bear his touch. The man who had once been her partner, her confidant, now felt like a stranger who had betrayed her in the most profound way. Clara's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one more painful than the last. How could she ever forgive him for this? How could she move forward knowing that the life they had built together was based on a lie? The questions were overwhelming, and Clara felt as though she were drowning in a sea of doubt and despair. In that moment, Clara knew that she had a choice to make. She could confront Carlos with the full force of her anger, demand answers, and tear apart what little remained of their relationship. Or she could walk away, leave the lies behind, and try to rebuild her life without him. But no matter what she chose, Clara knew that the trust they had once shared was gone forever. The discovery of Carlos's deception had changed everything, and there was no going back to the way things were. Clara's heart was heavy with the weight of that realization, but she knew that she couldn't make a decision in the heat of the moment. As Clara stood there, facing the man she had once loved so deeply, she felt a wave of sadness wash over her. The life they had shared, the memories they had created, now seemed tainted by the shadow of his deceit. Clara's mind flashed back to the years of sacrifice, the nights spent caring for him, the dreams she had put on hold, all for a man who had been lying to her. It was a bitter pill to swallow, and Clara could feel the sting of betrayal in every fiber of her being. But even as the pain threatened to overwhelm her, Clara knew that she had to stay strong, if not for herself, then for the future that still lay ahead. Carlos, sensing the gravity of the situation, began to plead with Clara, begging her to understand, to forgive him. But his words fell on deaf ears. The damage had been done, and no amount of pleading could undo the hurt that Clara felt. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and resolve, and told him that she needed time to think. She needed time to process what she had discovered, to figure out what her next steps would be. Clara knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but she also knew that she had the strength to face whatever challenges came her way. As Clara turned to leave the room, Carlos called out to her one last time, his voice filled with desperation. But Clara didn't look back. She couldn't. The weight of his betrayal was too much to bear, and she knew that if she turned around, she might never be able to walk away. With tears in her eyes, Clara walked out of the room, leaving behind the man she had once loved and the life they had built together. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. After the shocking discovery, Clara felt like the world around her had crumbled. The weight of the truth hung heavy on her heart, and she knew she couldn't avoid the confrontation any longer. That evening, as she stood in the doorway of their dimly lit living room, she took a deep breath, mustering all the strength she could. Her voice was steady, but laced with the emotion she could no longer hold back, as she called out to Carlos, who was sitting silently, as if waiting for the inevitable. "We need to talk," she said, her words hanging in the air like a storm about to break. Carlos looked up, his eyes meeting hers, and in that moment, the distance between them felt insurmountable. Clara could see the fear and guilt etched in his face, but it only fueled the fire inside her. "How long?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and sorrow. "How long have you been pretending?" Carlos's response was slow, hesitant, as if he were searching for the right words to soften the blow. But there were no words that could undo the pain he had caused. He finally admitted that it had been months, months of deceit, months of watching her sacrifice everything for a lie. The room grew colder with each word that passed between them. Carlos tried to explain his actions, his voice pleading for understanding, but to Clara his reasons felt hollow, devoid of the love and trust that had once defined their relationship. He spoke of fear, fear of losing her, fear of facing the reality of his illness, fear of what the future might hold. But to Clara it all sounded like excuses, feeble attempts to justify the betrayal that had cut her so deeply. "You were afraid," she repeated, her voice breaking. "What about me? What about everything I've given up for you?" Carlos tried to reach out to her, but Clara stepped back, her heart aching with the realization that the man she had loved for so long was now a stranger to her. "You lied to me," she said, tears welling up in her eyes. "You let me believe that you needed me, that I was the only thing keeping you alive, and all the while you were hiding the truth." The betrayal was more than she could bear, and Clara felt a wave of despair wash over her. How could he have done this to her? How could he have taken her love and devotion and twisted it into something so painful? Carlos's defenses crumbled as he saw the pain in Clara's eyes. He tried to explain that he never meant to hurt her, that he had convinced himself that it was for the best, that he didn't want to burden her with the truth. But Clara shook her head, refusing to accept his justifications. "You took away my choice," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You decided for both of us, and now, I don't know if I can ever forgive you for that." The words hung heavy in the air, a painful reminder of the trust that had been shattered. The conversation took on a life of its own, spiraling into a painful exchange of truths that had long been buried. Clara poured out her heart, revealing the toll that his illness, and now his deceit, had taken on her. She spoke of the sleepless nights, the loneliness, the dreams she had abandoned, all for the sake of their relationship. Carlos listened in silence, the weight of his actions pressing down on him, but there was nothing he could say to ease the pain he had caused. The damage had been done, and now they were both left to pick up the pieces of a life that had been built on lies. As the night wore on, the anger that had fueled Clara's words began to give way to a deep sadness. She looked at Carlos, seeing not just the man who had deceived her, but also the man she had loved, the man she had built her life around. "I don't know if I can do this anymore," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know if I can keep pretending that everything will be okay." The weight of the situation was overwhelming, and Clara felt as if she were drowning in a sea of uncertainty. Could their relationship survive this? Could she ever trust him again? Carlos, seeing the depth of Clara's pain, realized the gravity of what he had done. He tried to apologize, to find some way to make amends, but the words felt empty, insufficient to bridge the chasm that had formed between them. "I never wanted to hurt you," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I thought I was protecting you, but I see now that I was only protecting myself." The honesty in his words brought a fresh wave of tears to Clara's eyes, but it did little to heal the wound that had been inflicted. In the silence that followed, Clara knew that she had a decision to make. She could continue down the path they had been on, trying to salvage what remained of their relationship, or she could walk away, leaving behind the pain and betrayal that had come to define their lives. But no matter what she chose, Clara knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The trust that had been broken could not be easily repaired, and the love that had once seemed unbreakable now felt fragile, like a thread that could snap at any moment. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, Clara felt a sense of clarity wash over her. She realized that she couldn't make a decision in the heat of the moment, that she needed time to process everything that had happened. "I need space," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "I need time to think." Carlos nodded, understanding that this was something she needed to do for herself, even if it meant stepping back from the life they had built together. The pain in his eyes was palpable, but he knew that he had no right to ask her to stay, not after everything he had done. As Clara prepared to leave, she turned to Carlos one last time, her heart heavy with the weight of the decision that lay ahead. "I don't know what the future holds," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "But I need to figure out who I am without you." The words were a stark reminder of how much had changed, how much had been lost. But they were also a declaration of Clara's newfound resolve, her determination to find her own path, even if it meant walking it alone. Carlos watched as Clara walked away, his heart breaking with each step she took. He wanted to call out to her, to beg her to stay, but he knew that it was too late. The damage had been done, and now they were both left to face the consequences of his actions. As the door closed behind her, Carlos was left alone with his thoughts, his regrets, and the painful realization that he might have lost the most important person in his life. The silence that filled the room was deafening, a stark contrast to the life they had once shared. And as the reality of the situation set in, Carlos knew that nothing would ever be the same again. After the confrontation, Clara felt an overwhelming need to distance herself from the life she had known for so long. The days that followed were filled with a heavy silence, each moment a reminder of the betrayal that had shattered her trust. Clara spent much of her time alone, walking through the quiet streets, her mind replaying the events that had led to this point. The weight of her decision pressed down on her. Should she try to salvage what remained of her relationship with Carlos, or was it time to move on? The question lingered in her thoughts, but the answer remained elusive. Clara found herself revisiting memories of their time together, trying to understand where things had gone wrong. She thought about the early days of their marriage, the joy they had shared, the dreams they had built together. But now, those memories felt tainted, overshadowed by the lies and deceit that had come to light. Clara wondered if it was possible to rebuild their relationship, to find a way back to the love they once had. But each time she considered it, the pain of Carlos's betrayal resurfaced, making it difficult to imagine a future where trust could be restored. One afternoon, as Clara sat alone in a small park, she watched the world go by. People laughing, children playing, couples walking hand in hand. It was a stark contrast to the turmoil she felt inside. She realized that life was still moving forward, even as she felt stuck in a moment of profound uncertainty. Clara knew that she couldn't remain in this state forever. Eventually, she would have to make a choice. But the fear of making the wrong decision paralyzed her. What if she left Carlos and regretted it? What if she stayed and could never truly forgive him? The possibilities weighed heavily on her mind. In her solitude, Clara began to reflect on her own needs and desires, things she had pushed aside for years in the name of love and duty. She realized that she had lost herself in the process of caring for Carlos, that she had forgotten who she was outside of their relationship. Clara knew that before she could make any decision about their future, she needed to rediscover herself, to reconnect with the person she had once been. It was a daunting task, but Clara felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps this was an opportunity to start anew, to build a life that was truly her own. As the days turned into weeks, Clara found herself drawn to the idea of change. She began to imagine what her life could be like without the weight of Carlos's illness and the burden of their fractured relationship. She thought about the career she had left behind, the friendships that had faded over time, the dreams that had been put on hold. Clara realized that there was a part of her that longed for freedom, for the chance to pursue her own path. But with that realization came a sense of guilt. How could she think of leaving Carlos after everything they had been through together? The conflict within her grew stronger with each passing day. One evening, Clara received a message from an old friend, someone she hadn't spoken to in years. The friend invited her to a small gathering, and for the first time in a long while, Clara felt a spark of excitement. It was a chance to reconnect with a part of her life that had been neglected, to step outside the shadow of her relationship with Carlos. Clara hesitated at first, unsure if she was ready to face the world again, but something inside her urged her to go, to take that first step towards reclaiming her independence. With a deep breath, Clara decided to accept the invitation. The night of the gathering, Clara felt a mix of nerves and anticipation as she arrived at the venue. It was a small, intimate setting, filled with familiar faces and warm smiles. As she mingled with the guests, Clara realized how much she had missed this. Being surrounded by friends, engaging in light-hearted conversations, feeling a sense of belonging. For a few hours, she was able to forget the pain and confusion that had dominated her life. She laughed, she danced, she allowed herself to be fully present in the moment. And as the evening drew to a close, Clara felt a sense of clarity begin to emerge. Returning home that night, Clara knew that the time had come to make a decision. The evening had reminded her of who she was, of the life she had once enjoyed, and the person she had been before everything had changed. Clara realized that she couldn't go back to the way things were, not with the knowledge of Carlos's betrayal and the damage it had done to their relationship. But she also knew that she couldn't move forward without addressing the unresolved feelings that lingered between them. Clara decided that she needed to have one final conversation with Carlos, to lay everything out on the table and determine if there was any hope left for them. When Clara returned to their home, she found Carlos waiting for her, his expression a mixture of hope and resignation. He had been living in a state of limbo, unsure of what the future held, but knowing that whatever decision Clara made would determine the course of their lives. Clara took a seat across from him, her heart heavy with the weight of the conversation they were about to have. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. Carlos nodded, bracing himself for what was to come. Clara spoke openly and honestly about her feelings, the pain, the betrayal, the uncertainty about their future. She didn't hold back, allowing herself to be vulnerable in a way she hadn't been since the day of the discovery. Carlos listened in silence, his eyes filled with remorse as he absorbed the full impact of his actions. When Clara finished speaking, there was a long pause, a moment of quiet reflection as they both grappled with the reality of their situation. Finally, Carlos spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he said, "but I'm asking for it anyway." Clara looked at him, her heart torn between the love she still felt and the hurt that refused to fade. She knew that forgiveness was possible, but it would require time, effort, and a commitment from both of them to rebuild what had been broken. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she replied, her voice tinged with sadness, "but I do know that I need to move forward with or without you." The words hung in the air, a testament to the complexity of their situation. Clara could see the pain in Carlos's eyes, but she also saw a glimmer of understanding, a recognition that this was the consequence of his actions. In the end, Clara made the decision that felt right for her. She told Carlos that she needed time apart, to rediscover herself and figure out what she truly wanted from life. It wasn't a definitive end to their relationship, but it was a necessary step for Clara to heal and regain her sense of self. Carlos accepted her decision, though it was clear that it pained him to do so. They agreed to take things one day at a time to see where the future might lead, but without any promises or expectations. As Clara prepared to leave, she felt a sense of relief, a weight lifting from her shoulders as she stepped into the unknown. As she walked out of the house, Clara felt a mix of emotions, sadness for what had been lost, but also a sense of hope for what lay ahead. She knew that the road would be difficult, filled with challenges and uncertainties, but she also knew that she had the strength to face whatever came her way. Clara had made the decision to put herself first, to prioritize her own well-being and happiness, and as she took that first step towards a new chapter in her life, she felt a sense of empowerment, a realization that she was no longer defined by her past, but by the choices she made moving forward. And so we reach the end of this story of sacrifice, discovery, and decision. But before we part ways, it's important to reflect on the lessons Clara has left us. Life often places us in unexpected situations where we must choose between what is comfortable and what is right. Clara showed us that even in the most difficult times, when the ground seems to crumble beneath our feet, it is possible to find the strength to move forward, even if the path is uncertain and filled with challenges. Now it's time for you to think about your own life. Are there truths you're avoiding, situations you're not confronting out of fear of what you might find? And if you were in Clara's place, what would you do? What would you be willing to sacrifice to uncover the truth, and more importantly, to live in accordance with it? These are questions that can change the course of your life if you have the courage to face them head-on. But remember this, no matter how difficult the journey, you always have the power to choose whether you will let circumstances define who you are, or whether you will take control of your destiny and create the life you truly want. So what are you waiting for? Start making the changes you know are necessary right now. Life is too short to be lived in lies and regrets. If you enjoyed this story and want to keep learning and being inspired by content that can transform your life, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss any videos, and continue this journey of discovery and personal growth with us. Let's build a life with more truth, courage, and resilience together. See you in the next video.